In the bustling city of Springfield, Grace Harris had it all. She was known for her beauty, her wealth, and the seemingly perfect family she had built with her husband, Daniel. Grace had always been the center of attention, a woman admired by her peers and envied by others. She had everything she could have ever dreamed of: money, a beautiful home, a loving husband, and 2 healthy children. But there was one thing that Grace didn't want people to know. Beneath her perfect exterior, she harbored a dark secret. Her life had been built on betrayal, lies, and manipulation. Grace had used her charm and cunning to climb the social ladder, stepping on anyone who got in her way. She had always been driven by a desire for power and recognition, willing to do whatever it took to get what she wanted. And for years, it had worked. No one ever suspected the lengths she would go to for her own success. It was during a glamorous charity event that Grace made a fateful decision that would change her life forever. She had just secured a large donation from a wealthy benefactor, and she was basking in the adoration of the guests. But there, in the corner of the room, was a woman who had once been a close friend, Jenny. Jenny had been the person Grace used to confide in. They had been inseparable in their younger years, but Grace had long since distanced herself from Jenny. Jenny wasn't interested in the high society lifestyle that Grace had embraced, and she had become a reminder of the life Grace had left behind. That night, Jenny made a comment to Grace about the way she had changed, how she had become so focused on wealth and status. Jenny's words were simple, yet they struck a chord with Grace. She felt exposed, as though Jenny could see through her carefully constructed facade. Her jealousy and resentment towards Jenny began to bubble up, and a cold, calculating thought crossed her mind. What if Jenny wasn't around anymore? What if she just disappeared? In the weeks that followed, Grace became obsessed with the idea. She couldn't bear the thought of anyone questioning her perfect life. The whispers, the doubts, they all needed to be silenced. It wasn't long before Grace orchestrated a series of events that would lead to Jenny's tragic death. A car accident that seemed like a simple mistake, but in Grace's mind, it was a calculated move to rid herself of the one person who knew too much. The world mourned Jenny's death, and Grace played her part perfectly. She was the grieving friend, the supportive wife, the perfect mother. No one suspected a thing. Yet deep down, Grace felt something stirring inside her, a gnawing feeling that she had crossed a line she could never return from. As the months passed, Grace's life continued to unfold as she had always hoped. She and Daniel had another child, a beautiful baby girl they named Lily. But despite the outward perfection of her family, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that karma was lurking just around the corner. Every time she looked at her children, she felt a pang of guilt. What if the cost of her betrayal was more than she had bargained for? Then, it happened. Grace's perfect life began to unravel in the most unexpected way. She had always been in control, always the one pulling the strings. But now, things were slipping out of her grasp. First, her second child, Ethan, was born with a severe disability. The doctors couldn't explain it, but Grace refused to believe it was anything more than bad luck. But then, her third child, Ava, was diagnosed with a rare genetic disorder. As the years passed, it became clear that Grace's children were not only physically disabled but also struggled with emotional and mental health issues. As each child was born, their disabilities became more severe. One by one, Grace's children were diagnosed with conditions that required constant care and attention. Each of them needed specialized treatment, therapy, and support, making life increasingly difficult for Grace. She had gone from being the woman who had it all to a mother overwhelmed by the demands of her 6 disabled children. But Grace didn't realize what was happening until it was too late. The more she tried to ignore the consequences of her actions, the harder it became to avoid the truth. Karma had finally caught up with her, and it wasn't just Jenny who had paid the price for Grace's deceit, it was her children, too. Grace tried to keep up appearances, to maintain her flawless image, but the cracks were beginning to show. Her once perfect home became a place of chaos and exhaustion. The constant care her children required left her with no time for anything else. She couldn't understand why this was happening to her. She had been so careful, so precise in her calculations. But it was clear now, there was no escaping the consequences of her past. One evening, As she sat in her dimly lit living room, surrounded by the noise of her children's cries and the weight of her guilt, Grace realized something profound. She had been so obsessed with her image, so determined to achieve perfection, that she had forgotten one crucial thing. True happiness and fulfillment don't come from wealth, power, or beauty. They come from love, from honesty, and from the choices you make every day. It was too late for Grace to undo what she had done to Jenny, but she could still change the future for her children. They were her responsibility, and she would spend the rest of her life making amends. But deep down, she knew that karma had already delivered its final verdict, and there was no turning back. As months passed, Grace's life took a turn she had never anticipated. The realization that karma had come for her children had set in, but she still couldn't fully grasp the true weight of the consequences of her actions. She had always been a woman who believed in control. She controlled her appearance, her wealth, and her relationships. But the sudden, overwhelming challenges with her children were a force far beyond her reach. Ethan, her second-born son, had always been a joyful child. His bright blue eyes and contagious laugh brought light into their home, but that joy had been replaced with uncertainty. He was now 2 years old, and instead of growing and developing like other children his age, he had regressed in both his speech and motor skills. Grace told herself it was just a phase, a developmental delay that would pass with time. But the doctor's visits and tests confirmed her worst fears. Ethan had been diagnosed with a neurological disorder that would require constant care for the rest of his life. Then there was Ava, her third-born daughter. Ava had been diagnosed with a rare and progressive genetic disorder that left her unable to walk or speak. Grace was devastated, but she could hardly admit it. She had always thought she would be the perfect mother, one who raised perfectly healthy, well-behaved children. Instead, she was drowning in the daily demands of caring for kids who needed more than she knew how to give. Despite the relentless challenges, Grace still tried to maintain the outward image of perfection. She hired private nurses, therapists, and specialists, trying to ensure that her children received the best care money could buy. But money, as it turned out, could not fix everything. Her children's needs were endless. As Grace watched them struggle, she was overwhelmed with a profound sense of guilt. These children, who had once been her dream, were now the embodiment of the very thing she had tried to outrun: consequences. It was in the midst of this turmoil that Grace's mind began to turn. She knew she had made a grievous mistake, but there was no one to blame but herself. Every time she looked into the faces of her children, the guilt ate at her insides. She couldn't escape it. No matter how hard she tried to push it away, she knew that her actions had led to this point. The night Jenny died, Grace had buried her feelings beneath the perfect life she had built. She had told herself that she had done what was necessary, that Jenny was just a nuisance who had stood in the way of her success. But now, looking at her children, she realized that Jenny's death had been more than just an obstacle removed. It had been the catalyst for her own destruction. Grace had tried to convince herself that karma was just a superstition, that things like this didn't happen. But the universe, as she was learning the hard way, had its own way of delivering justice. The universe had seen the darkness in her heart, the selfishness that had driven her every decision, and now it was showing her the price of those choices. The guilt was suffocating, and she found herself becoming resentful of the life she had built. Her wealth meant nothing when she couldn't enjoy it. Her social status meant nothing when she was too consumed with caring for her children. Her beauty and charm were irrelevant when she couldn't even take care of the ones who mattered most. She realized, too late, that the things she had sought so desperately, money, fame, admiration, had never truly brought her happiness. And now, her children were suffering because of it. As the weeks went by, Grace found herself growing more and more isolated. She stopped attending the social events she once adored, unable to face her friends who had no idea about the pain she was going through. Her husband, Daniel, seemed to be drifting further away as well. He was a good man, but he couldn't understand what she was feeling. He was focused on work, on the outside world, while Grace was buried in her own personal hell. Their once solid marriage was beginning to crack under the pressure of the mounting responsibilities. In moments of quiet reflection, Grace would often ask herself, "What have I done?" She would look at her children, at their innocent faces, and feel the weight of her decisions. It was as though the universe had given her a chance to make amends, to change her ways, but the price was too high. She had sacrificed her own happiness for success and had taken her children's well-being for granted. One night, as Grace sat in the dim light of her living room, the house eerily silent except for the sound of her children's breathing in the other room, she couldn't ignore the pain any longer. It wasn't just physical pain, it was the emotional and mental toll of years of selfishness. The house, once a place of joy, felt like a prison now. She had built this life, and now it was suffocating her. In the stillness of that moment, Grace understood something she had never known before. Real happiness was never in what you achieved or how you were perceived by others. It was about the people you loved and cared for. But she had let her ambition blind her to that truth. And now, she was paying the price. As time passed, Grace felt herself being pulled further and further into a void. Her once glamorous life was slipping through her fingers, and she could no longer hold up the facade she had so carefully constructed. The children, her precious children, were her responsibility now, and she couldn't escape the relentless feeling that she had failed them. She had failed them long before their disabilities showed up. She had failed them in the way she had lived her life, in the choices she made, in the way she had treated people around her. Daniel, her husband, had become a distant figure in her life. He was there, physically present, but emotionally detached. The burden of caring for their children fell almost entirely on her shoulders. Grace had always thought she could manage anything. She had always been able to control situations, shape outcomes, but now, as the reality of her life set in, she realized that control had been an illusion. Her guilt weighed on her like a heavy cloak. At night, when the house was quiet except for the sound of her children's restless breathing, she would often find herself crying. She thought about Jenny, the woman she had discarded so easily, who had, in Grace's eyes, been a roadblock to her perfect life. Jenny had been a casualty in the pursuit of success, and now, as Grace's children struggled, she felt the sting of that decision more sharply than ever. At first, Grace had refused to believe in karma. She thought it was just a superstition, a story people told themselves when life didn't go the way they wanted. But now, she couldn't escape the truth. Karma had shown up in the form of her 6 children, each one more fragile than the last. And with each day that passed, Grace saw more clearly that there would be no escaping the consequences of her past actions. One particularly hard day, as Grace sat in the playroom watching her children struggle with basic tasks that children their age should have been able to do easily, she was overwhelmed with despair. Ethan couldn't feed himself anymore, Ava couldn't hold a toy in her hands for longer than a few moments before she dropped it, and the others, too, faced their own challenges. The house felt like a cage, each room echoing with the silent screams of her heart. But as the days turned into weeks, something inside Grace began to shift. She couldn't run from her mistakes forever. She had tried, but the weight of her choices was too heavy. In the past, when things got difficult, Grace would push harder, work longer, and manipulate situations to her favor. But this was different. There was no controlling this. There was no getting out of it. No amount of money, no amount of social climbing, would change the fact that she had hurt innocent people. She had hurt her own children. And so, one day, after a particularly difficult doctor's visit, Grace sat on the stairs of her grand home, her head in her hands. She had been so consumed with herself for so long that she had forgotten what it meant to truly love someone. Not just in the way one loves with words, but in the quiet, selfless way that means putting someone else's needs above your own. That evening, Grace made a decision. She couldn't undo the past, but she could change how she approached the future. She could stop running away from her mistakes. She could stop blaming the world for her unhappiness and start taking responsibility for her actions. She needed to embrace her children for who they were, as they were, and learn to love them with all of her heart. It wasn't going to be easy, she knew that. The road ahead would be long, and the pain she had caused could never be erased. But if there was one thing she knew now, it was that her children needed her. They needed her more than her career, more than her status, and more than her wealth ever had. The days that followed were full of challenges. Grace enrolled herself in parenting classes for children with disabilities, she joined support groups, and she sought therapy to work through her guilt and feelings of inadequacy. Slowly but surely, she began to change. Her life wasn't easy, and the burden was still heavy, but Grace knew that this was the only way forward. She could no longer pretend that she had it all figured out. Her husband, Daniel, noticed the change in her. He saw her struggle, but he also saw her dedication. He began to take part in caring for the children more actively. They started working together as a team, and while their marriage was far from perfect, they were trying to rebuild it, one step at a time. For the first time in a long time, Grace felt a glimmer of hope. She had begun to understand something crucial about life. Redemption wasn't about erasing the past, but about how you moved forward from it. The past couldn't be undone, but she could live better, for herself and for her children. She wasn't going to let her mistakes define her. Instead, she would let her actions in the present define her. As Grace spent more time with her children, she found a new kind of joy, one that was quiet and subtle but deep and meaningful. She realized that her children were teaching her just as much as she was teaching them. They showed her the value of patience, the importance of unconditional love, and the power of resilience. They were fighting every day, and so was she. And though the road was far from easy, Grace had finally come to understand that the real power in life lies not in what you have, but in what you give. And so, she gave everything she had, her time, her energy, her love, and slowly, she began to rebuild the life she had once thrown away. Our actions have consequences, and no amount of wealth or success can shield us from them. True redemption comes not from escaping our mistakes but from facing them head on and learning to make amends. It's in the way we choose to live after we've hurt others that defines us, and in embracing responsibility and love, we find the strength to heal ourselves and those we've wronged.